Hey American Government class, Mr. Sharon here. Hope you had a nice April vacation and we're ready to get back into things. Today we're going to be talking about the 1950s. So you have an assignment where you're looking through the book and you're kind of picking out stuff that you're interested in about the 1950s. So this PowerPoint's going to cover a lot of that information. So as we take a look at this, the first thing we see a bunch of houses. So this is actually a picture of one of the Levitttowns. So something important to know about the 1950s is after World War II ended and millions of soldiers came home, well, there was a bit of a housing shortage and there really wasn't much space to live in cities. People were ready to expand out. They wanted to buy their own houses. They wanted to get out of apartments. They wanted to have a little bit of property, even though, as you can see in this picture, a lot of the yards were kind of small. So it created this demand for a housing industry. The problem was a lot of people couldn't afford to buy these big, expensive, custom-made houses. So there was this one guy, William Levitt, ran a company, Levitt & Sons, and he had an idea to buy up large lots of land and then subdivide it down into roughly about a quarter acre each of property, which really isn't that big. You can see it in this picture. And the concept was if they used just about the same exact plans for each house, they could mass produce these things and they could do it quickly and they could do it really cheap. And therefore they could build houses that would be very cheap for people to buy and they could meet demand. So this was really the birth of what we call the suburbs in the United States, where a lot of people moved out of the cities, but they also moved out of rural areas, and they went into this kind of in-between place where you had a little bit of property, a little bit of privacy, you had your own house, but it wasn't really like you were out in the farmlands, but you weren't in the city. So this is called the suburbs. Actually, the last neighborhood I lived in Wallingford, it was very similar, and I'm sure some of you live in these types of communities. They're housing developments where if you go down the road, all the houses follow a pretty similar setup, whether they're all ranches, raised ranches, colonials. Chances are that a lot of the places where people live today were originally housing developments. One company built all the houses based on very similar plans, and that's what made the houses cheaper. And this was mainly late 1940s, early 1950s. So moving on. So key concept here. After World War II ended, we saw mass demobilization like we've never seen before. Demobilization is when soldiers start to come back home after war. So by the end of the war, the United States had 12 million soldiers deployed. And within a year of the war's end, so by mid-1946, that 12 million was down to 3 million. So 9 million soldiers came back home. And obviously that's going to have a huge impact on life in the United States. One of those impacts is there was some fear about what's going to happen to all these soldiers coming back. Is there going to be jobs for them? If they can't find a job, how are they going to afford anything? How are they going to afford housing? What if they want to go to college? Because a lot of the young men who were either drafted or signed up for the military had just gotten out of high school. Would they have an opportunity to further their education? So this was all addressed in something called the GI Bill of Rights, which we've had various versions of throughout the years. We still have one essentially in effect today. I'm sure you've heard that if you serve time in the military, I think it's usually you do your 4 years, then you'll get very generous financial aid benefits. The military will kind of put you through college. So there's a lot of benefits to joining the military today. So the foundation of this, the framework was really set up with this 1944 GI Bill of Rights. So the first thing that it did is it offered 1 year of unemployment benefits to all returning soldiers who couldn't find work right away, which honestly didn't end up being a problem because the economy boomed. They received financial aid for college, At the time, it was $500 a year for college tuition, which would be equal to about $6,860. A couple years out of date here, but if you adjust it to the value of money in 2017. So, I mean, it's something, it's better than nothing. And then they also got home and business loans. So this would make it easier, because usually if you want to buy a house, you have to put a certain amount of money as a down payment, usually somewhere between 10 and 20%. These VA loans, they would be called. If you're a veteran, you can put a much lower down payment down, maybe like 5% on a house, and you might even be able to get a lower interest rate, so your monthly payments will be less. So these are just examples of the government trying to help out people who put their lives on the line to protect the country. So after World War II ended, you got to think about this. So 1929, stock market crashes. We go into this era of the Great Depression. The Great Depression kind of starts to ease up a little, and then we go into World War II. So between 1929 all the way until 1945, there weren't many Americans starting families. It just wasn't a good time to have kids in the United States. So very similar to, depending on how long this COVID-19 pandemic goes on, we're going to look back at these statistics years from now, and I guarantee you're going to see a drop in births during when all these lockdown effects were in place. Really, I would guarantee from 2020, maybe into 2021, hopefully everything will be cleared up by then. But a lot of families are saying, why do we want to have kids right now with all the uncertainty of this, with how long it's going to be before there's a vaccine? So it's a very similar kind of climate during the Great Depression, during World War II. Why do you want to bring kids into a world where you're really uncertain about what the future holds? So if we look at population growth through the years, it's kind of hard to see from this graph. I should probably come up with a better graph in the future. But between 1910 and 1920, it looks like population growth is probably about 10 million people. 1920 to 1930, it looks like maybe about 15 million people. And then you see between 1930 and 1940, it barely goes up. Now, between 1940 and 1950, you see a population growth there of, it looks about 20 million. Here's the catch. That population growth, the majority of it was between 1945 and 1950, once World War II ended and the soldiers returned home. 1950 to 1960, it looks like probably about another 25 million. So the baby boom generation is defined as people born between 1946 and 1964. It was the largest era of population growth in the United States when you look at the percentage change in the population from, I want to say it was 1940 through 1955 alone. There was a 27% increase in the US population, which is still the largest increase on record percentage-wise over a 15-year stretch. The Sun Belt. So we saw a huge population shift in the 1950s. And you can see that this continued all the way up through 1990. It still continues to this day. If you look at the states that are growing the fastest, it's going to be mostly in the southwestern states, like New Mexico, Arizona, California still sees big growth, Texas. But one of the reasons that we saw a huge shift from this population up north, and especially in the Northeast, all the way out to the southern and western states, which the Sun Belt is roughly all these states in blue, aside from Alaska. We wouldn't really consider that the Sun Belt. Sun Belt being called that because of the warmer climate. So air conditioning had been around all the way dating back to 1902. The problem was air conditioning, the units were really big and they were only used in businesses, places like really movie theaters. As of the 1950s, they began to sell window units. So what we think of today, that you open up your window, you pop the unit in, you close the window down, you have an AC. That became a thing around 1950. And once that became widely available and everyone started to buy window units in the South, you could live there year round. Before that, if you wanted to live in Texas, Arizona, one of these places, even down in Florida, it would be a nice place to visit during the winter, maybe when the temperatures were in the 60s. But to go there in the summer, when you're having a bunch of days in the 90s or over 100 and you have no air conditioning, that's not a nice place to live. So more than anything, I would argue, air conditioning, that innovation really led to a massive population shift to the South. So far things don't sound too bad. People were starting families again. There were protections for soldiers through the GI Bill. People were buying houses. Houses were affordable. I made reference to the economy doing well. You saw people moving to other parts of the country. The one downfall with all of this, it was only temporary, but for a good 3-4 years after the war ended, we went through a period of mass inflation. So inflation means the value of the dollar goes down. So if that doesn't make sense to you, another way to look at it is you can buy less with your money. So essentially, the price of items goes up. So if one day you go into a store and you can buy a bottle of Mountain Dew for $1, and then the next day you go to the store and you can buy that same bottle of Mountain Dew at the same store for $2, that would be mass inflation. All right, so before you could buy an entire bottle of Mountain Dew with your $1. Now you can only buy half as much with your $1. So that's inflation. And inflation naturally occurs over time, which is why a lot of times you're going to hear your parents or your grandparents talk about, oh, when I was a kid, you could buy a new car for $5,000 or $10,000. And obviously today, if you want a decent car, you're going to have to pay at least $15,000, if not more, for a brand new car. Does that really mean things are a lot more expensive today? Not necessarily. People made a lot less money back then too. It's just the value of money changes over time. So let's get into why this happened. The main reason why there is mass inflation is because during World War II, the United States rationed goods, which we're actually seeing right now through the pandemic. If you go to the store, at least most stores my wife and I go to, you're only allowed to buy a certain number of certain types of products, meat products. I know for a while, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, but you can only buy 1 or 2 packs of ground chicken or ground turkey or ground beef. Rubbing alcohol, I'm not even sure if that's around yet, the isopropyl disinfectant alcohol. If it is, I'm sure it's being rationed. Hand sanitizer would be rationed. Toilet paper was being rationed. So you were only allowed to buy so much of certain goods. We did this during World War II because there are a lot of goods that were needed to be shipped over to help with the war effort. Food was included. Cars stopped being made because all those automobile plants needed to be converted over to manufacture wartime stuff. Now, this is very similar to what's going on today with the Defense Production Act. So World War II was the Wartime Production Act. Today we're calling it the Defense Production Act. The government takes control of certain businesses and says, hey, right now we don't need cars. Right now we need you to build something else that will benefit the country. And once that act is invoked, the Defense Production Act, well, that company must build whatever the government says it needs to build. So the United States has put the Defense Production Act in effect for certain things like making N95 masks today, ventilators. During World War II, those car plants were shut down to make other things. Now, when World War II ends and the Wartime Production Act goes out of effect, and now all these businesses can start producing goods that people didn't have access to, that were maybe they were being rationed, and now they want to buy them again. Well, they can't make enough of these goods to meet demand. And when supply and demand get messed up, there's low supply but very high demand, the price of goods goes up. So it took 3 or 4 years really for production to meet the demand of American consumers, making prices of all your items go up drastically. But eventually production caught up and inflation leveled out. So that was just a temporary problem. Franchise businesses became very popular throughout the 1950s. So franchise businesses, you get the definition there, you can read that. So in other words, franchise business, someone comes up with a concept, some kind of idea. Holiday Inn is the example that your book gave you. So there was a guy who was traveling the country, and he was upset that it was really hard to find hotels. When you did find a hotel, the costs were all over the place. The service was very inconsistent. You didn't know what to expect if you traveled the country. And he said, why not just come up with one hotel, one brand, and that ended up being Holiday Inn, and make it predictable. So no matter where you go across the country, you'll know you can find a Holiday Inn. You know what it's going to be like. You know what the room's going to look like. You know what the service is going to be like. You understand the costs, the parking situation. It standardizes everything. So with a franchise business, someone comes up with a concept and then they essentially sell their idea and allow other people to use it. McDonald's is another example of this. So McDonald's was a restaurant started by a couple of brothers, I think the McDonald's brothers, in the late 1940s. Another guy came along in the mid-1950s and said, I'd like to franchise this. So he bought the rights to McDonald's and he franchised the idea out. So now anybody can open up their own McDonald's. They have to pay some kind of fee. I'm not sure if there's, it depends on what kind of contract you sign, but there could be recurring fees, or you might have to share a certain percentage of your profits with whoever owns the name. So in this case, it would be McDonald's. And you have to follow certain rules. You would have to offer certain menu items, maybe at certain prices. Your employees will have to wear certain uniforms. You'll have to use the McDonald's logo. But otherwise, it's your McDonald's to operate. It's being franchised out. So a lot of people criticize this idea. They say that it's killed originality in the United States. A lot of people say it's kind of the death of small businesses. I don't know. It has its pros and its cons. Franchises, you know what you're going to get. It's predictability. And a lot of people like that. They don't like to take chances and risks. We saw the growth of the service sector. So roughly by the end of the 1950s, the service sector became the biggest part of our economy in the United States in terms of total number of employees. So a service sector would be businesses that provide services such as healthcare, law, retail, banking, or insurance. I would also kind of consider education as part of the service sector. So you're not necessarily selling a good, you're selling a service. Although retail, you'd be selling goods, but you're providing that service of making the goods available. So these are called white-collar jobs. In other words, you can go to work in a white shirt and you're not going to get dirty. So this is when we started to see kind of the downfall of manufacturing in the United States. Manufacturing jobs, we consider blue-collar jobs. That's when you're actually making stuff. Blue collar, you go to work, you're wearing a blue shirt, and maybe the dirt won't show up on the shirt. Yes, that's really the concept behind white collar and blue collar job nicknames. So just to make sure this is clear, because a lot of people get a little confused, it's like, well, at a grocery store, you know, you're stocking shelves, it's kind of like a blue collar job in a way, but the goods are being made somewhere else. They're being manufactured somewhere else. Let's say you have canned goods. They're being produced at a farm, maybe, and then shipped to a factory where they're being put into the cans, and then they're being shipped to the service sector, which would be the grocery store, where the grocery store is providing this service of selling the goods to you. The grocery store doesn't actually make the goods. All the goods are manufactured somewhere else and then shipped to the store for sale. So during the 1950s, this concept of the nuclear family pretty much defined life in the 1950s. So the concept was your typical household should consist of a mother, a father, and children. And this was the expectation for life in the United States. If you didn't fit this mold, you were kind of considered an outcast, for better or worse. Part of the problem with this was that women had entered the workforce in large numbers during World War II. When there was a demand for workers, a lot of the men, we just talked about 12 million by the end of the war, 12 million men were fighting in World War II. That created a huge gap in manufacturing jobs in the United States. So many women filled those roles. After World War II, there was kind of this expectation that women go back into the house, you stay at home, the man would be what you call the breadwinner. He'd make most of the money, and the woman would have children and raise the children. That was really viewed as her role. This wasn't totally embraced. So after World War II, you did see kind of maybe a slight decline. A lot of women went back into this kind of nuclear family type role. But at the same time, so many women had a taste of living outside of the house, doing something other than just parenting and cooking and all these stereotypical roles of females at the time, that they didn't want to turn back. And a lot of women, maybe they weren't working full-time anymore, but they went into part-time jobs. And the 1950s is really when we started to see this era of growth where more and more women were going into the workforce. And roughly by the end of the 1950s, 1/3 of the workforce were female. And out of that 1/3 of the workforce that was female, about half of them were married. So yeah, more women were going into the workforce. And as you can see, this is a trend that's continued over the years. This graph shows between 1950 and 1998, different age breakdowns of how many women were in the workforce. You also had a couple cultural movements emerging. The Beatniks were a group that was a precursor to the hippie movement of the 1960s. The hippies are much better known, mainly because of Woodstock and I don't know, the infamy surrounding that event, depending how you look at it. But Beatniks, they were a group of artists and writers who resisted conforming to cultural norms. They were this group that said, hey, especially in the 1950s, we saw a certain view of society, this nuclear family. Everybody buy a house, have a nice little yard, go to work, you live a very normal life, you follow certain cultural rules, cultural standards. And the Beatniks started to rise up against this, saying, hey, we're kind of going in this direction where we're all just becoming clones of one another. We're all exactly alike. Look at franchise businesses. You start to see a place like McDonald's all over the place. Everyone's eating at the same restaurant, eating the same food. They said, this is bad. We're dressing alike, we're thinking alike, we're behaving alike. We need to have differences in society. So then you saw this go to another extreme. In the 1960s, the hippies kind of branched off this. And that was all about sex, drugs, rock and roll, kind of do what you want, don't follow all the rules. As long as you're not hurting anybody else, feel free to live your life the way you want to. Computers started to play a role. Usually we don't think of computers really until the 1980s or 1990s. Well, 1980s is when the personal computer started to become a little more popular, where a regular family could own their own computer. And then that really took off in the 1990s with the internet becoming a household item. But what a lot of people don't know is computers have been around for a while, dating back to the late 1930s. They started to create computer technology. Originally it was for government use only. But then in the 1950s and 1960s, you started to see computer technology become available to businesses. So more businesses were using them. One of the first computers dating back to around the early 1940s was called the ENIAC. And right here, this is a picture of it. So the ENIAC, try to wrap your heads around this. This was a single computer. It was the size of 3 basketball courts. It was over 1,000 times less powerful than the cell phone that you hold in your pocket right now. This is how far computer technology has come. We have something in our pocket that is over 1,000 times more powerful than a 300-foot computer from the early 1940s. But because of this innovation, because of something like the ENIAC, this original computer, we have what we have today, technology-wise. Everything gradually progresses. Another big innovation of the 1950s, you had the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. Very important. So today our interstate highway system is named after President Dwight Eisenhower. The reason for that, he's the president who signed it into law in 1956. He was also the main commander of forces in the European part of World War II before he was president. So there are a couple of goals of the Interstate Highway Act. Before this, you just had your local roads, mainly two-lane roads. And Eisenhower said, why not create this system where you have multi-lane roads, you connect city to city to make travel easier, to improve the economy, because if you have easier travel, especially to the cities or from the cities, people will go out and they'll buy more things. They'll go out to stores, for example. The tourism industry. You started to see places like Disneyland and Disney World open after this because people could actually travel and go on vacations easier if travel time was reduced by having these multi-lane interstate highways where you could go 65 miles an hour. The other purpose was in case of wartime. So if we ever got into a war, what would be the easiest way to transport soldiers across the country if we had a fight in our own territory? Have multi-lane interstate highways to be able to do that. To have tanks and stuff traveling all these windy back roads is not going to be very efficient. So how did this change things? Well, one of the main results of the Interstate Highway Act is you saw this huge boost in consumerism where people would buy as much as they possibly could, often on credit, meaning you're paying for stuff now, you're buying things now and paying later. Today, the main way we do that is through credit cards, where you swipe the piece of plastic or the chip or whatever, and then you don't have to pay for it until the end of the month. So that's buying on credit. We saw the birth of shopping malls. So your first indoor shopping mall, I want to say, was right around 1956. So it's no coincidence that the Interstate Highway Act is passed that year and they start building all our nation's interstate highways and you start to see indoor shopping malls pop up. People can travel now. They're going to drive out and they're going to go to these big shopping centers. The ironic thing about that is shopping malls, when we look back at history, it's going to be a relatively short period of U.S. history where the shopping mall was kind of king. Shopping malls, they're not building new ones anymore. We're actually getting to a point where you're seeing more shopping malls close than open. I want to say that in the last decade, last statistic I saw was in the last decade, not a single indoor shopping mall in the U.S. had been built. At its height, there were over 1,000 of them. What's the reasons for this? Technology, the internet. People are doing online shopping. Usually you can find something a lot cheaper on Amazon than if you go into a mall and buy something. What's the main reason people still go to the mall? Just to go in and walk around and peruse. That's what my family and I do. We bring the kids out, and other times, obviously not during the pandemic, but we'll go to the pet store in the mall. We'll just kind of walk around and look at things, but very rarely do we actually buy anything. So shopping malls are closing all across the United States, and unless they can kind of change what the purpose of a shopping mall is, I know a lot of shopping malls are starting to have doctor's offices in them and things like that to kind of fill the space. You're going to see more of these closing in the near future. 1950s, big economic boom for the United States also brings in multinational corporations. So before World War II, most of your US companies, well, they only operated in the United States. They only had factories in the United States. They only sold their goods in the United States. Some of them might have sold some stuff overseas. But your biggest group of consumers was in the US. Beginning in the 1950s, multinational corporations, you have companies that they're operating everywhere. They have factories overseas. A lot of the times that's for the purpose of getting cheaper labor. A great example of a multinational corporation would be Walmart. So Walmart is viewed as a US company. It was created as one. As you can see, these statistics might be a year or two out of date, but as of the time of this graph, there were 4,625 Walmarts in the United States, but you also have about another 1,500 of them in other countries as well. Popular household appliances in the 1950s that changed lives. Well, the best example was the television. Before this, if you wanted to watch stuff, you had to go to the movie theater. That would include the news. Throughout the 1940s into the early 1950s, the majority of Americans, for entertainment, still listened to radios. Once televisions became affordable, it absolutely, totally changed the way of life in the United States. Most of your television shows were targeted toward the baby boom generation. So television producers knew that you had this huge population of young kids. There was that 27% shift in the population between 1940 and 1955. So a lot of the programming was targeted toward them. When you looked at the shows, they didn't really cover many sensitive issues, political issues, societal issues. They were like sitcom shows about just everyday life. Here's your nuclear family. Everything was happy-go-lucky. There were a lot of cartoon programs, kid shows. So it kind of created this idealistic version of what life was supposed to be like in the United States, according to TV producers. And television, it's another thing that 1950s innovation, kind of on the way out. I know a lot of people don't have cable anymore. A lot of people use the streaming services. A lot of people just watch shows on YouTube, which 10 years ago, you would have never imagined this happening. It's actually happened pretty quick. But TV, I don't know. What kind of future does TV have? It's some kind of future. It's just going to be a lot different than what it's been in the past. So that's an overview of some of the key concepts of the 1950s. Hope you enjoyed that and found it informative.